Croeso, welcome, diolch yn fawr I dod, thank you for coming. Croeso I Hoelion wyth Cymdeithas, welcome to Pillars of Society and our launch event and talk with Ken Murphy. Fy enw I ydy Emily Laurent, sorry, dwi dysgu Gymraeg. My name is Emily Laurent and I am Community Art Coordinator at Carmarthen Gallery in Carmarthen. This project is funded by the 15-minute Heritage Grant Programme, a collaboration between the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Cadw, the Welsh Government's Historic Environment Service. So a big thank you to them for enabling this project. Before I tell you about the project, a little bit of housekeeping. If you could stay muted, that'd be great. You can turn your camera off if you like, get comfy. You can come and go. We haven't got a scheduled break, so please feel free to take one if you need one. We will be recording the event, but we will only be recording the speakers' faces, so you won't be seen on the recording. We will be recording and transcribing the event and releasing it on our YouTube channel. So if you know anybody, I know it sold out very quickly. If you know anybody who wanted to come and didn't, it will be available to watch later. This project is about well-being as much as anything else. So I'll try to remember to remind you every half an hour or so to look away from the screen and have a little stretch. I'm going to talk about the project for about 5 minutes. And then I'm going to hand over to Lisa Evans from Carmarthen School of Art. And then we'll have our talk on the history of Carmarthen, followed by questions. So I want to start with a quote from a Persian poet and philosopher from the 10th century, Omar Khayyam. I only just read this today and I just thought it was so fitting. When I want to understand what is happening today or try to decide what will happen tomorrow, I look back. And I just thought that was such a fitting quote about the project. I am using notes, by the way, that's why I keep looking down. So, Hoelion wyth Cymdeithas, Pillars of Society, is an Carmarthen Gallery community project. For those of you who don't know, Carmarthen Gallery is the main publicly funded gallery in Southwest Wales. We're currently closed, obviously, but even in these times, we have an amazing amount of things happening at the gallery. We're shortly going to release some amazingly beautiful podcasts made with Ensemble Cymru. We still are teaching, we're teaching children and young people online. And we are having an upcoming exhibition with Helen Booth. So please follow the gallery's social media and keep in touch with us because some amazing things happen at Carmarthen Gallery. Hoelion wyth Cymdeithas, Pillars of Society, will investigate statues and monuments in Carmarthen, specifically the Picton Monument, which I'm sure many of you will know is a very large obelisk commemorating Sir Thomas Picton, who was a Welsh army officer, a slave trader, and the colonial governor of Trinidad. He was killed at Waterloo. We will also look at the statue of William Nott in Nott Square in Carmarthen. Nott Square in Carmarthen. Sorry, they're all in Carmarthen. And William Nott was an army general who fought in India and Afghanistan. We will look at the Crimean War Memorial on Lammas Street. Interestingly, a war more famous for its nursing than its fighting. The Gorsedd stones erected in Carmarthen Park for the 1974 National Eisteddfod, and Gwynfor Evans's plaque, which is on the Guildhall, and was put up in 2016 to mark 50 years since Evans was returned as the first Plaid Cymru MP. The project is a response to the national and international debate around public art and colonial history. We hope it will provide an opportunity to discuss race, equality, diversity, Welsh identity and language, Welsh independence, and the experience of Wales as coloniser and colonised. One of the fascinating things about this project, I think, are the links between some of these themes. So Iolo Morgannwg, who was very, very famously sort of created the way that we celebrate the National Eisteddfod, was also an ardent anti-slavery campaigner. And Gwynfor Evans campaigned against wars in Vietnam and the Biafran War in Nigeria, wars that were arguably a result of colonialism and neo-colonialism. In terms of its relevance, on the 26th of November 2020, First Minister Mark Drakeford, also born in Carmarthen, published a document called The Slave Trade and the British Empire, an audit of commemoration in Wales. This audit identified 209 monuments, buildings or street names across Wales that commemorate people who were directly involved with slavery and the slave trade or opposed to its abolition. These commemorations often appear without any accompanying interpretation, as is the case with the Picton Monument. The result of this is that figures are presented solely as role models, often heroes, rather than representatives of some of the most challenging aspects of our collective past. To quote Mark Drakeford, "This is not about rewriting our past or naming and shaming. It is about learning from the events of the past. It is an opportunity for us to establish a mature relationship with our history and find a heritage which can be shared by us all." On this project, we will be working closely with students from Carmarthen School of Art, and we'll hear more about this from Lisa Evans in a little bit. These students will be participating in a series of workshops with artists and creating ideas for alternative works of commemoration, or perhaps questioning the very idea of commemoration and memorialisation. We will also work widely with local residents. There are lots of opportunities to get involved, and I will tell you about some of them later. The outcomes of the project will include new interpretation of the statues and monuments that we are going to look at via QR codes, a walking tour with accompanying map, and an augmented reality app which will showcase the alternative public artworks designed by the participants. The project will run until April 2021. So I'm now going to hand you over to Lisa Evans, who's going to tell you a little bit more about Carmarthen School of Art and their involvement with this project. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Noswaith, good evening. So I'm Lisa Evans and I'm the Programme Director of the Sculpture Programme at Carmarthen School of Art. And just to extend on what Emily was saying about the project and our involvement as a department, so it'll be our first years that are taking part within this project. And it's basically how students choose to respond to the 5 specific public works of art that are in Carmarthen, considering Welsh identity and colonial history. It seems very fitting that the college is taking part and getting involved in this project, as it is obviously an incredible kind of provider of education in the town and a long-serving establishment within the community. Mae'r myfyrwyr yn edrych ymlaen I dechrau meddwl, I dechrau ymchwilio ac I ddod lan â syniadau ar prosiect, trwy arlunio a creu modelau 3-dimensiwn i'r syniadau terfynol. Having the opportunity to participate in such a live project for our first years is incredibly engaging and an experience to provide crucial professional skills for them as they kind of progress and move forward within the degree programme. Ar ben hynny, mae'r gweithdai a'r sgyrsiau ar-lein gydag artistiaid, haneswyr ac arbenigwyr yn eu maes a drefnwyd yn ymddangos yn ymrywiol ac yn hynod gyfoethog gyda'i cynnwys. So therefore we really look forward to being a part of this project and look forward to the responses by the students. Rydym yn edrych ymlaen at fod yn rhan o'r project yma ac yn edrych ymlaen i'r ymatebion. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Lisa. We're really excited to be working with the college, such a wonderful centre of excellence for the arts. We're very lucky to have Carmarthen School of Art in Carmarthen. And the gallery work with the college in lots of different ways. But this is very exciting to have a big project where we're working very closely. So I just wanted to mention a few things that are coming up as part of the project that members of the public are able to engage in. So we have a series of talks. On the 11th of February, we have a talk on colonialism with historian Dr. Chris Evans and artist and curator Dr. Omolkhaya Mohammed. On the 25th of February, we have a talk with artist Angela Maddock and sculptor Sarah Toombs. On the 11th of March, we have a talk from Dr. Sarah Yunan from National Museums Wales and with artist Wanda Zaboska. On the 25th of March, we are going to have a talk on community and community building and how to create robust and resilient and caring communities, which feels to be very much at the centre of this project, really. There will be some kind of public event in April. I'm sure you'll all appreciate we are living with some degree of uncertainty right now, and we don't know what the regulations will be like then. We are hoping to have a public event, an outdoor public event where people can walk between the statues and monuments and have a look at the augmented reality app and have a little play with that, because that's going to be a fun thing. Other opportunities to get involved. As with most community art projects like this, we are required to do a certain amount of evaluation and feedback collection. And we also really want to know whether projects like this can change feelings and attitudes. So we have 2 online feedback forms, one in English, one in Welsh. And I will share a link to those forms in the chat later. And if you are getting emails from Eventbrite, if you signed up through Eventbrite, you should also have links to those surveys in an email from Eventbrite. It's really, really valuable and important to us to gather that feedback. So if you've got a spare 5 minutes, please take the time. There's also some very interesting questions on that survey. Questions that you might want to have a really good long think about, and there's quite a lot of space to write stuff as well. There are also opportunities to volunteer, so please get in touch if you would like to volunteer on the project. I will put my email into the chat as well. And we also have a few spaces left on the project for participants. We have maybe 3 or 4 spaces left if people want to actually participate in the project. So we are opening that up to young people who are not in full-time education, aged between 16 and 25. So if you fall into that category, if you know somebody who does, please get in touch. We've also got a Facebook page, a dedicated Facebook page for the project. So please like and share and comment. Please feel like it's your project and you can get involved. So it's probably time to quickly rest your eyes and have a stretch. Okay, so we're just going to turn away from the screen. Have a little stretch any way you like. I'm not going to attempt to be a yoga instructor here. But just, yeah, a 30-second break for your eyes, very beneficial. And as I said before, we're not having an official break, an official comfort break. So please feel free to take one whenever you need one. So I am now going to hand over to Ken Murphy. I'll just introduce you, Ken. Ken is a field archaeologist with over 45 years experience. Graduated in archaeology and geography from Southampton University in 1976 and subsequently worked on a number of field and other projects in various locations in England before joining Dyfed Archaeological Trust in 1979. Ken will answer some questions as we go along, so you can put some questions in the chat. Please feel free to use the chat function, by the way. I didn't say that at the beginning, but yeah, if you want to say hi to somebody, or if you've got any comment to make, please use the chat function. And if you've got a question for Ken, put it in the chat as we go along, and Ken will try and answer as many questions as he goes along as he can. But if it's a more complex question, I will note it down, and then Ken will answer it at the end. We'll have a dedicated question and answer session. Okay, Ken, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'll just share my screen. So it's a bit of a slideshow. So you probably hear, well, you will hear a disembodied voice for most of this slideshow, unfortunately, but it's better than looking at me, I'm sure. So I'll just see if this works. It did in the practice earlier. So there we are. Can you see that? Is that okay? You should be seeing. Okay, good, excellent. So that's my first slide. Really, what I'm be talking about is why is Carmarthen here? Why it came about? Why certain streets are where they are? Why we walk in certain ways down certain streets? But also about the people who created these streets in the town. So that's the main thrust of my talk. But to start with, just to go back 2,000 years, as it says in that cover here on this book that we produced about 20 years ago, it is the oldest town in Wales, and it has got the most complex history of any town in Wales. So there we are. Right, good. So 2,000 years ago, going back to pre-Roman times, when Wales was a well-settled, well-populated country. This distribution map just shows hill forts and defended settlements as they were 2,000 years ago. But note there the very dense number of these settlements across mid-Pembrokeshire into Carmarthenshire and up the Tarry Valley. So really quite a well-populated country at that time. So when the Romans came along with their military conquest, they encountered quite severe resistance, not surprisingly. And around about into Wales, about AD 70, the Romans first came. They'd conquered what we now call England, or southern England, Midland England, and then turned attention to northern Britain and the west. Came to West Wales about AD 72 and built a whole series of forts as part of that conquest, linked by Roman roads. And you see the little forts there as red dots. Carmarthen, a well-known Roman fort. Llandilo, discovered about 16 years ago when we discovered the fort at Llandilo. And now, in addition to this, on this map, there would be a fort at Wyston, which is just north of Haverfordwest. So a really big military conquest took place. And what happened is that at Carmarthen, they built a fort which is now roughly occupied by Spilman Street. So I don't know how clear you can see that map, but that's the fort there outlined in blue. So about 72, AD 72, they constructed this fort. It's a classic Roman fort and would have accommodated about 800 troops. So it's a big military conquest. The fort at Llandilo is bigger. That would have taken perhaps up to 4,000 troops at one stage. So we're not talking about just a small garrison of people. It is a big Roman conquest that took place, which implies a big population at the time. But what happened is that the Romans, there was a bigger rising in the north of Britain, and the Roman army was taken away to deal with that from Wales. And so the fort was abandoned and slighted, so it couldn't be used again. But 10 years later, around about 83, 84 AD, they returned to finish the conquest and came back to the same place, but this time built a smaller fort, which is there in purple, perhaps about 300-400 troops this time in Carmarthen. And essentially the Roman conquest, military conquest, was finished around about 110, 120. And at that point, most of the Roman army was then withdrawn from this part of the world, apart from perhaps a small garrison. But what the Romans did do is the way they consolidate their hold on their newly conquered, what Britain then became part of the Roman Empire as Britannia, and the way they consolidated their hold on it and exploited the newly conquered land was to found towns and invite people in to settle into those towns. And Carmarthen is a classic small Roman town, one of only two in Wales. The other one is at Caerwent near Newport. They're called Civitas capitals, which essentially means they're the administrative centre and commercial centre for this part of the world. And that's the red there shows the outline of the Roman town, and it was a defended town, and a classic Roman grid street pattern was laid out with what's now Priory Street roughly running down the centre of the town. And quite amazingly, that although it's always known there's a Roman town at Carmarthen or somewhere near Carmarthen, actually its position or its location wasn't identified until the 1960s. A chap, Professor Barry Jones of Manchester University, identified it. We can see it quite clearly in this aerial photograph. You can see the sort of pattern of the rectangular shape of the town, particularly on the far side, which is the Richmond Terrace, following a line of defences. So it is very surprising. It took so long for it to be identified. And that's what the town may have looked like in its heyday. And when the town was founded around about 110, 120 AD, the Romans would have invited people in to settle there, but also not probably local people at that stage. It's following the military conquest, you wanted people who were going to be loyal to Rome. And so there would have been ex-soldiers from the army who stayed in the area. They would have been, after 25 years service, would have been then made Roman citizens, would have been given a pension. They'd have acquired skills, literary skills, literature skills, they'd be able to read and write and so forth. Administrators would be needed to deal with this new town. People from the towns in England, some of those have been in existence, the Roman towns, for 50 years when Carmarthen was founded. People have seen opportunities in Carmarthen to move west and take those opportunities. And also it was a port, and people would have come in, traders would have come in, some would have settled in, seen great opportunities in this sort of virgin town to trade and to make a living. So essentially the early years of the town would have very much been an immigrant town of Carmarthen, from people not just from what would have been perhaps now England, but also from further afield. And particularly the Roman army, the legions who conquered Wales, were recruited in Spain. So you've probably seen quite a big Spanish contingent in Roman Carmarthen in its early years. But of course it was in existence for 300 years, and as time went on, what would have been a local population realised the advantages of living in a town, would have integrated the town, and over time the actual complexion would change quite quickly of that population. It was an amphitheatre. That's just a reconstruction of that, which is obviously, you probably all know, you've all been there, seen that on just off Priory Street. And it still does affect the way we live, the Roman town. This is looking obviously along Priory Street. The Roman east gate of the town would have stood just about without cream-coloured houses. And if you look along what's the beginning of Richmond's Terrace from Old Oak, you may have wondered why those houses sit slightly higher than the road. The reason is they sit on the old defensive bank of the Roman town, and the road actually runs along what have been the defensive ditches of the infill defensive ditches of the town. And when you go along Richmond Terrace, you turn a corner to the left, that's curving round the town defences, and then at the far end you turn left again around a curve, and that's the far end of the end of the Roman town. So where you drive now is very much influenced by decisions made by people almost 2,000 years ago. We did some excavation in the late 1970s. This is Parade Road, which is just down from St. Peter's Church. And there, this is the defensive ditches section of the Roman town. Classic V-shaped ditches. There have been 2 of those concentric ditches running right way around the town with a big bank on the inside with timber revetments. Later in the Roman period, translated into stone. A stone wall was rather than an earthen bank. We can see the scale of those defences which would have protected the town. And it was a classic Roman town with a forum and other administrative buildings. And although these rather unprepossessing buildings now on Priory Street are not particularly wonderful, but this is the forum site of the Roman town, roughly under those buildings somewhere. We were hoping just on the right-hand side, you may remember some excavations took place about 2 years ago there before the new constructions were put up. We were hoping that would have hit the forum, but it's not quite. So the forum area is still a bit further back. And we did lots and lots of work in the 1980s prior to the construction or building of Richmond Park School. And the stratified archaeological deposits here were quite remarkable. We had to build up a picture of the town as it changed and developed over 300 years. And at the beginning, AD 120, one of the first buildings to be constructed was a temple. You see it there, there's a reconstruction at the bottom. A square temple, probably 2 stories, classic Mediterranean style building, red roofs, red tile roofs, and very substantial. It would have been, at the time, the largest and most spectacular building probably ever built in Wales. It didn't last long. And by 30 years later, it had gone. The excavation we did here just happened to come down like a crossroads in the town, so actually be able to build a picture of how this changed and developed. So by AD 150, we're looking at domestic buildings here, houses, timber-framed houses, thatched roofs, probably quite modest. 20 years later, quite a busy little part of the town, houses, workshops, shops, and so forth. But then by AD 200, for some reason we're not quite sure of, they much decayed. The buildings were deserted, became ruinous, and that bit of the town was virtually abandoned. But then started to pick up again 20 years later, and by AD 250, it's a really, really busy bit of the town. Quite substantial houses built here. The bottom photograph there, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but that's stone foundations of a single house, which in actual size is about 3 or 4 times the size of a modern house. So it's a big, big building, and workshops, a granary for grain store, iron working was taking place, all sorts of craft activities. So very busy, but then by 320 AD, again virtually abandoned, had gone downhill. By 350, a few more buildings appeared, and finally, towards the end of the Roman period, it was virtually abandoned, just a couple of very small dwellings. And we know by 410 that that Britain was no longer part of the Roman Empire. There's a famous quote which said that Britain had to look after its own defences. So the Roman legions left Britain, and it was virtually left to its own devices. And what we don't know is really what happened between 410 in Carmarthen, that is, between 410 and the late 11th century, with the coming of the Normans and the Norman conquest. Expect that some settlement still occurs, some people still lived in the old Roman town or in the area of the Roman town, and at some stage there was a monastic settlement established on what became later St. John's Priory, which I'll say a bit more later on. And it may be also that the original St. Peter's Church was also founded at some time, perhaps in the 8th, 9th, 10th century. But again, we just don't know. But the suspicion is that's the case. But certainly it would have been no much more of a low-key settlement compared to what had come before. But everything changed. Sorry, just one more thing, sorry, one more slide on that. This is obviously St. Peter's Church, looking along King Street. The St. Peter's Church is built upon the west gate of the Roman town. And that was been recognised elsewhere in the Roman world, that often the gatehouses of Roman towns were actually converted into churches, or the sites are reused as churches. So this may well have been the case here. If you often wondered why the road rises up very slightly there at King Street, you can see on that photograph. And the reason being is it's rising up over the defensive bank of the Roman town. And that's why you'd walk up a very slight slope there over that flattened defence of the Roman town. But I say everything changed in the late 11th century with the Norman conquest. And what happened here is that it was again nowhere near the same scale as the Roman conquest. It's often described as like a free enterprise conquest, with Norman lords just hacking their way into West Wales, taking what they could, and establishing a castle at Carmarthen, the site where it is now. Initially quite a small castle, a Motte and Bailey castle, earth and timber. As time went on, it was translated into stone and eventually became the English Royal Castle of South Wales. It was a main admin centre for Royal Administrative Centre for South Wales, along with Carmarthen Castle. So it was the most important castle in this part of the world by far. But as you know, it's not particularly fared well. But more of interest to us in many ways, that's just what survives. You're aware of that. The rather fine gatehouse which is still there, but the rest of the castle is pretty much gone. But say more of interest to us is actually what happened around the castle and the military, which accompanied the military conquest. So the way that the Normans acquired and actually held their territories and exploited it was exactly the same as the Romans. They founded towns, and at Carmarthen, it's quite clear just outside the castle gates, a small walled town. And what they're doing here is again, just as the Romans did earlier, inviting in settlers to come into Carmarthen and providing them with security in the sense of a walled town, but also giving them rights and privileges. So these settlers coming in from southwest England, perhaps Bristol, Somerset, Devon, even Cornwall, coming into Carmarthen, being made free men, burgesses, which was a big incentive to take that up, being given or granted land, a burgage plot in the town in which to build a house, and given rights and privileges. And the town would have had rights to hold a market, a weekly market, and annual fairs. And those rights are really closely guarded. You had to, if you were in the lordship of Carmarthen, you had to come to market to sell your goods, to trade and do all your business. And if you didn't do, you were stiffly fined. The penalties for not doing so were really quite onerous. So that's the way the Norman lords maximise the profits from their newly conquered territory. At the same time, what they're doing is bringing in people who are loyal to them, who will fight on their behalf, because this was a hostile territory to them for a couple of hundred years. So you didn't want the newly conquered people to be in that town. You wanted your loyal people. So it's quite a small town, as you see. I don't know how well you can see out the image, but it's a small walled town centred upon the castle, with two marketplaces, two interconnected marketplaces, one in Nott Square and one in Guildhall Square. They've sort of got a bit lost now, that particular marketplace in Guildhall Square, because the Guildhall is built in what would have been a marketplace. But behind the Guildhall Square, where the shops are now, was been a St Mary's Church. And if you go into the basement of some of those shops, you'll find the remains of that church built into the modern houses, into the modern shops, still surviving. And it was a cemetery there as well, that when some work was done, a new, I think it was an electricity cable was put in down the side of the Guildhall some years ago now. It's quite clearly cut through various burials. So a church, a cemetery, and two marketplaces that were the centre of the town, the commercial centre of the town. And again, if you've often wondered as you wander up through Nott Square, why that road narrows quite sharply at the end before you get to King Street. And the reason being, that's where the East Gate stood to the defended town. And that gate apparently stood until the 18th century, until it's finally demolished, because it's an impediment to traffic. And Guildhall Square, again, looking down here to Dartgate, or the Wynford Gate, which is long gone. But this is, again, another marketplace. The meat market and fish market, the Shambles was called the meat market. Again, it's lost an awful lot of its character now, unfortunately. But the town quickly expanded outside those sort of quite tight confines of the walled town, and perhaps in a generation or two, it had grown so much that new burgish plots are laid out. And on Lammas Street, again, you may have wondered why you've got such a big, wide street in Lammas Street. This was probably laid out in, we think, in the 13th century as a marketplace, and so the big, wide street could accommodate a market and perhaps also annual fairs as well. And burgish plots been laid out at either side of that street. So quite a long-lived street in that case. And also along King Street would have been more burgish plots laid out as well. So the town was expanding very quickly during the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries. In addition to founding castles, founding towns, the other big contribution that was made by the Normans, the Anglo-Normans, was the foundation of monasteries into Wales. And the first one was this one, the Augustinian Priory of St. John the Evangelist, founded, you see there, about 1115. And these European monasteries were real centres of learning and knowledge right across Europe. And by founding these in Wales, it really, for the first time for many centuries, Wales was really tapping into that intellectual powerhouse of Europe. Up to this point, the society got quite insular within Wales. This suddenly opened up whole new areas of learning and scholarship. And although they were actually initially probably recruited monks and priors and so forth from the mother houses in Europe, pretty soon they were actually the local population were actually peopling these monasteries. And they did become very much centres of Welsh learning and knowledge, so much so that actually there was quite a bit of tension a bit later on between the Anglo-Norman lords and the monastic priors, between, actually they'd very much gone native, as it were, the monasteries, much to the annoyance sometime of the Norman overlords. But anyway, St. John's was established. It's just off Priory Street, and you may not even know it's there nowadays. This is it. If you go down Old Priory Road, down towards the bypass, you'll see this. And this is looking along what would have been the church of St. John's. And the centre of the church is now occupied by a sewage pumping scheme, which you see there, and the rest of the monastic enclosure is allotments. And all that survives on the ground, which you would not even know about unless you look extremely hard, is that wall on the right-hand side, is actually the north wall of the medieval church, the only bit that survives. It's not done too well, but something does remain. So again, if you look, the left-hand photograph is taken from Priory Street itself, looking down Old Priory Road through that arched opening. And with all monastic sites, they sat within a walled enclosure with a gatehouse. And this is the gatehouse. And it's not just the site of the gatehouse, but I think it's about 25 years ago when renovations took place to these houses, which just look like now 19th century cottages. It's actually, that is a medieval building. A complete medieval building is hidden behind that cement render. So it is the medieval gatehouse to the priory, just there. You'd have to look very hard to know that nowadays. The most beautiful building in Wales, and it's not the Wilkinson store. If you were standing here 600 years ago, you'd be standing on the high altar of the Franciscan Friary Church, which was described as the most beautiful building in Wales. It's now the car park and Wilkinson's, and nothing whatsoever survives of this, what would have been one of the most magnificent buildings in the country. We did a lot of work here in the early 1980s before the old Tesco store was built, which is now Wilkinson's. And I won't go into any detail of this, but it was a huge amount of excavation took place. And you can see just how, on the right-hand photograph, just how deep some of the remains were. This is excavating, you see there a couple of graves, a couple of skeletons, which would have been in the side aisle of the chancel to the church. And on the left-hand side is excavating remains of a stained glass window. When the friary was dissolved by Henry VIII, 1866, that part of it burnt down, and stained glass window just fell out onto the floor. And that's what it looks like on the ground after several hundred years. But we were able to reconstruct that. That's the bright red images of the reconstructed stained glass window as it would have been several hundred years ago. Oh, that's actually the emblem of Resap Thomas, that those three ravens, and he was buried in the Friary Church, and then his tomb was removed to St. Peter's Church when this one was dissolved. And that's what it may have looked like in its heyday. You say a really quite impressive set of buildings. And if you just keep your eye on that building on your left-hand side, that's the gatehouse. Again, very similar to the Priory, a walled enclosure with a gatehouse off Lammas Street. And I'm not saying this is the original gatehouse, the Bargain, Booze and Spa, as it is nowadays, but that alleyway you walk through, that arch there, is almost certainly the location of the medieval gatehouse into the Friary. So it's just preserved over centuries. Actually, it's very difficult to actually erase rights of way, and so the right of way is preserved even though the buildings have long gone. And Carmarthen continued to grow. This is as it may have looked in 1415. But if you go back a bit earlier into the 1340s, and that time, 1348, 1349, was not a good time to be alive. We know, we're very familiar with the pandemic as we are now, what we're living through at the moment. But then 1348, the Black Death came to Europe and wiped out about 30% of the population within a year. And Carmarthen and all towns basically suffered enormously. I mean, it may have been some urban centres suffered 50% loss of population, just simply wiped out. And some towns in Wales never recovered. There's I don't know if any of you know Llawhaden in Pembrokeshire. It's a castle there now. That was quite a large town in the 1320s. It simply wiped out by the plague and never recovered. And many towns suffered the same. Kidwelly was extremely badly hit. And there's reports there, even going out into 16th century, several hundred years later, that the population had not recovered by then. It was still virtually a deserted town. So, but Carmarthen did fare extremely well. So it recovered, bounced back very quickly by the looks of it. And certainly by 1415, there was Carmarthen that the burgesses were allowed to actually extend their town walls to encompass King Street and Spilman Street. So quite a large walled town was then created, which just suggests very much a prosperous, thriving community at that period, and say had overcome the Black Death quite successfully and recovered. It may well be that actually the reason for these town walls was the result of the Glyndŵr rising 10 years earlier, when the towns across Wales were very much targeted by Glyndŵr and his followers, as they were still seen as being, if not actual places of English oppression, but actually the sort of symbols of physical English oppression. So they were very much targeted. And you do find that a lot of the town charters, which were issued perhaps in the 12th, 13th century, were reissued following Glyndŵr. And some of the language in them is by modern days quite racist, in the sense that it often would say that no Welshman may try an English person, no Welshman may live in a certain town, this sort of thing. So actually there was still quite a strong racial overtone or racial distinction between what was happening in towns and what was happening in the countryside further afield. But having said that, when you actually look at some of the lists of burgesses which occasionally survive down the ages, you do find a mixture of English and Welsh names in those towns. So I think the town charters aren't quite reflecting what actually the reality was on the ground. But even so, it was quite a reaction to the Glyndŵr rising of the early 1400s. But anyway, Carmarthen did seem to bounce back very quickly and grew and grew. And nothing now survives of those town walls, but you can still just about make out traces of them or where they were when you know where to look. So, for instance, Jackson's Lane, we think there was a gate at the bottom of that lane, hence the reason why Jackson's Lane is there. And if you go to the end of King Street and you look along this little alleyway, Conduit Lane, you may sort of wondered why it's there. It's a bit of a strange sort of thing to have. Well, the reason it's there is that the building on the right-hand side, that wall, would have been the line of the town wall, built in 1415. And so that little alleyway, you would just be walking along outside the town, as it were, outside the town wall. And of course, that's just got preserved as a feature in the town. So that's why that is there, from decision made by someone 600 years ago to build that town gate and town wall just at that location. And that's what medieval Carmarthen may have looked like in its heyday. So the people of Carmarthen have survived very well. I hope I've demonstrated here just what a potentially mixed population has come into Carmarthen over the past 2,000 years. Sometimes as a result of war and conquest, sometimes just as peaceful moving in. And although the people have survived, it must be said that the town or the medieval elements of the town have not survived quite so well. And unlike many places across Britain, you have to look quite hard to see those remnants of the medieval town. The castle, as we know, the gatehouse survives, but a jail was then built on the site of the castle, and then County Hall, all of which have contributed to it being somewhat make contribute to its disappearance. The castle's not survived well. The Priory, at the top of that image there, has gone completely, apart from the gatehouse, which is pretty much disguised under modern buildings. And the town walls, town gates have all gone. And the Friary, most beautiful building in Wales, is now a car park and Wilkinson's. So it's rather sad in many ways that things have gone, but I think it's in many ways also it's the people are still here, and we're probably all descendants of those Romans and Normans, Flemings, and all sorts of people who were invited to come into Carmarthen at some time in the past. So I think at that point I will stop there. I won't go past the medieval period, because that's perhaps someone else's area of expertise, not mine. So that's it really. I'm happy to take any questions or observations or whatever. So over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Ken.
I shall end this if I can. There we are.
Thank you, Ken. That was such a fantastic talk, and it's amazing just to hear about what a sort of vibrant and diverse mixture of people have created and made up Carmarthen over the years, and really interesting to see the fortunes of the town rising and falling. Obviously, Debenhams is closing, and that's a big, that's a blow for the town, but it's sort of reassuring in a way to engage with the history and think, okay, well, it's sort of, things have gone up and down before. I love as well how there are traces of all these kind of different towns. They're almost kind of layered one on top of the other, and there are traces. I love that, especially traces in walkways and rights of way and passages, and it makes me think about how that fits in with the project and how we're doing a walk through the town on some of those pathways that are really ancient. So we've got a few questions coming in. Can you see them, Ken?
Okay.
I'm happy to read them out if you want, or you can.
I've got one about the Roman remains between near Liddell's. Where exactly are we there?
Dr. M's is behind Wilkinson's.
Oh, I know. Yes, yeah. That's the Civil War defences there. So they were built in the 1640s to protect the town from, well, during the Civil War. They actually are the best surviving, apart from Newark in Nottinghamshire, they are the best surviving Civil War defences in Britain. Those big earthworks there. So they only be actually in use for, as it were, for a couple of years, but they were very extensive. They ran up from where they are at Liddell's, up towards the church on the corner, and actually turned and ran underneath what is now Debenhams. So a massive set of earthwork defences.
Wow. Can you see we have a question about the oak tree? This is the tree that Merlin was said to have sat under. I think it's called Merlin's Oak. And there's a piece of it in, Carmarthenshire museums have a piece of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think there's a piece of it in St. Peter's Hall, I believe. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, please, on the comments.
Yeah,
I do know a little bit about that oak tree, because we are actually doing a project about oak trees as well in the autumn.
Okay.
Do you know anything about it?
Well, when I first came to Carmarthen, it's over 40 years ago now, I went searching for it because it had just been removed, I believe, from its position, an old oak, which is now the mini roundabout on Priory Street. So I was a bit disappointed it wasn't there. I don't know much about it now. I mean, it's one of those things probably more by tradition than anything else. I mean, oak trees can live for several hundred years, but I can't imagine one would have lived from almost 2,000 years. But yeah, apart from that, I don't know anything about it at all.
Okay. There is a question here from Wanda Zaborska, one of our contributing artists. Did the Romans erect any statues or memorials? Interesting question. Do we know anything about that? I mean, they were into statuary.
Oh yeah, they would have done. We don't know any. Trying to think. No, there's none known from Carmarthen, but they would have done, no doubt. And we haven't located the cemeteries which would have been going with the Roman town. We did a bit of work not far from the amphitheatre and found a couple of graves there. So it's probably the cemetery is one cemetery, maybe between the amphitheatre and the east gate of the Roman town. And certainly there would have been memorials there in those cemeteries. They say that they're fond of their statues and memorials. Certainly if you go further east into Caerwent and particularly Caerleon, a Roman legionary fortress, and the museum there, you find masses and masses of Roman statuary, Roman memorials and so forth. But none so far in Carmarthen. They will be there somewhere.
That's interesting. Unfortunately, probably under a supermarket.
Well, probably under the what's now those buildings on Priory Street, which is not.
Yeah.
But we don't know. But there would have been definitely.
Yeah. A question here, I think from another contributing artist. What do we know about the people of the area pre-Roman? Is it the Dementii?
Yes. Yeah.
I do not know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. Quite a bit actually. Not particularly around Carmarthen, but we've done quite a bit of work on various sites in the area, and essentially they are quite a sophisticated people who lived here pre-Roman times, and we actually just as I suppose an aside, we did some work 2 years ago now, or 18 months ago, when a chariot burial was discovered in Pembrokeshire, which has quite clear contacts with art, sort of very nice piece of metalwork with it, artistic metalwork. So quite sophisticated pieces of metalwork with those, and also the fact that there's quite high carpentry skills and other skills required to make that. So people were, it's quite a sophisticated society at the pre-Roman times, and also highly populated countryside. I mean, it's often thought, oh, it's just a bit of a backwater and not much happened here. But where we've done some quite intensive work around Cardigan area, it looks as though the actual number of Iron Age, i.e. pre-Roman settlements then, 2,000 years ago, was roughly the same as there are modern farms. So you're looking quite a populated countryside. So yeah, so we know quite a bit, but that's a bit of a separate sort of talk and subject really to go into that. We've done a lot of work there. We know a lot about them.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
We probably know far more about what happened in the couple of centuries before the Roman conquest than we do about a few centuries afterwards in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries.
Interesting that there's that gap. Is that what they call the Dark Ages?
It is. Yeah, we don't like to call it that anymore, but
okay.
Yeah, but it is, yeah.
There's another question here about the stream that used to run along what is now Blue Street and Red Street. Do you know when this was diverted or covered over and why?
Don't know when. No, I suspect that the what's now the sort of bus station area was a bit of a tidal inlet, but I don't know when it was culverted. No, but it would have been that area which is now sort of St John's Car Park. That area, Marks and Spencer, seems to have been quite sort of marshy, boggy area until relatively recently. You know, perhaps even to the sort of 16th, 17th century or so. So it's but yeah, some of these details you just don't know when things happened.
There's a question here about the cottage. Somebody used to live in a cottage in Friars Row, tucked behind Lammas Street. Are they likely to be medieval? Do you know that street?
The Friars Row. It's a bit further up Lammas Street, isn't it, than the Friary, I think. But certainly those the plots, the Burgish plots we call them, along Lammas Street are probably all laid out in the 13th century, perhaps even a bit earlier. So yes, the sites of them are medieval, but the houses won't be. The houses are all rebuilt probably in the 18th, 19th century. But you may find, sometimes you do find sort of earlier bits sort of incorporated into later buildings, as mentioned about St Mary's Church on Guildhall Square, where it looks, if you look at the outside, those shops just look like, I don't know, 20th century shops almost. But you go into them and root around, you actually find the walls are medieval walls and surviving, but they're often coated in plaster and cement and stuff, so it's difficult to recognise. So you do get those little bits surviving, but again, it's the same as the Priory. I mentioned that bit of garden wall surviving. Well, we did some work there again actually it's the first bit of work I did when I came to Carmarthen in 1979. There was some excavation there because of the sewage pumping scheme that's taking place, and the bit of wall which looked like a garden wall, in fact when we had a good look at it and rooted around, did find it was part of the north wall of the church, and actually had some niches built into it which had some burials built into the wall.
Wow.
So until you actually start going to that sort of level of detail, you don't even know these things are there. And look at it nowadays, just say it's a stone built garden wall, probably of 19th century date.
Yeah, that's amazing. This is a good question. What might have happened in the amphitheatre? And was it large by Roman standards?
It's not. It's for a small town. The amphitheatre was they're supposed to be able to take the population of the town. So it gives you perhaps an idea of the size of the town. It's a modest size amphitheatre. It would this idea it's used for sort of gladiatorial contests is probably. Certainly in Carmarthen, I can't imagine it would have ever taken places, but it would have had for performances, for meetings. If a general announcement was going to be made, that's where you would have gone to hear it. Had plays there, say all sorts of things taking place, games of just various descriptions. But I can't really imagine that you had in Carmarthen gladiatorial shows taking place, or if they were, they're probably just like demonstrations rather than the full thing.
It's great. It sounds like basically a community centre.
Well, that's what they basically what they are. Yes, it's where you'd all gather for various whatever. Yeah,
sounds great.
A theatre, community centre, political stage, whatever.
Yeah, lovely.
Multi-purpose site.
Yeah, great. There's a question here from our technical helper, Chris. Are there any future excavations planned around Carmarthen, or any areas you would like to excavate? Don't say the whole of Carmarthen.
There's nothing planned. The most recent one was that one on Priory Street. Was that 2 years ago now? Now the houses are now built. It's the Housing Association have built a house there on what was the garage. Denzel Evans's garage, and that takes place as because of a planning condition that's put on that. So it's a commercial excavation essentially. So as part of the work, the developer has to excavate. I'll get someone to excavate the site. That was quite a long bit of negotiation took place with that particular site. And although it's quite a big development, the houses behind the street frontage were not excavated below those, because actually they could build their foundations over the Roman level, so they didn't disturb them. It's only at the street frontage where actually the Roman levels deposits get quite close to the surface, and therefore the only way they could deal with that was actually to excavate the footprint of the building. But excavation is an extremely expensive business, and so now what happens if developers can avoid it, they don't excavate, they find other ways of getting around it basically, which is to say design foundations which don't damage the archaeology. So nowadays, the big lot of work we did at the Friary before what is now Wilkinson's was built, and also the row of shops, Merlin's Parade. Nowadays, you wouldn't excavate that. The developer would just say we will just design foundations which sit above everything, which is a bit frustrating for us. At the same time, that was done in that work, and the Friary was, I think, about 1981 through to about 84, and it was done as part of all those old enough to remember, manpower services scheme, those job creation schemes of the early 80s. And so we had about 40 or 50 young people, mostly unemployed people, working on that full time for like 2-3 years.
Wow.
And if you did that nowadays as a commercial project, you're talking about a few £1 million.
Yeah.
So they just don't do it, unfortunately, unless they have to.
Yeah.
So in London, it still happens, because if you're building a huge tower block, which is costing you £1 billion, well, a few £1 million for archaeology is nothing.
Yeah, I know some amazing things have been found on the Crossrail project, haven't they?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I mean that's huge. But then they've got no option. That sort of scale of engineering work. So you either go somewhere else or you excavate. But yeah, it's hugely expensive.
So there's some lovely comments. So thank you for that. I'm not reading out all the comments. I'm just going to concentrate on questions.
No problem.
There's an interesting question here about whether it's possible to trace the ethnicity of various Romans and later settlers by family names. That's a good question.
That's an interesting one, yes. Quite difficult to say that you can look back at some of the documents which they often did so-called surveys of towns, which list all the burgesses, perhaps in the 14th, 15th century, a bit later, and you can sometimes tell by the names whether they are of English descent or Welsh descent quite clearly. But apart from that, it's very difficult to do so. I mean, I forgot to mention in Carmarthen, when the Norman town was founded, is that further west into Pembrokeshire, there was quite a big influx of Flemings there. That's quite well documented. And so certainly Haverfordwest, which was a comparable town to Carmarthen, was almost entirely populated by Flemings, so much so that Flemish was the language for a couple of centuries in Haverfordwest. And there, certainly southern Pembrokeshire, Little England beyond Wales, the earlier population, as it were, the Welsh population, was driven away. I mean, what we now call ethnic cleansing took place there. In Carmarthen, around Carmarthen, it didn't seem to happen. Although Flemings came in as part of the other immigrants, the actual hinterland of Carmarthen, they much stayed as a native population, as it were. So it's quite different, even quite short distances apart. Different ways of actually the invasion took place is very much different. What you can about ethnicity, it's very difficult to tell that. We have done quite a bit of work on when you get cemetery sites and good bone preservation, which is quite rare, you can do work which you can tell where the origins, where people were from, by looking at their, it's called isotopic analysis of their teeth. Because what happens is that some of the elements, strontium, in your teeth remains when you spent your first 7 years of your life. Is very different signature to where you spent your latter years of your life, and you can tell by various chemical analysis, by the water and other things that these chemicals are in, where people spent the first few years of their life. And when we looked at some of these early medieval cemeteries, the 8th, 9th centuries in Pembrokeshire, you find that actually there's a huge number of people are not local, were not born there. And actually quite remarkably how far some came afield. So there's a lot from, certainly in Western Pembrokeshire in the 8th, 9th centuries, from Western Ireland, moving into the area, from Scotland, from Eastern Wales, from England, but also from the Mediterranean area as well. And actually one individual was definitely from from Eastern Turkey, somehow found their way into Western Pembrokeshire in the 9th century. So even that period, it was quite surprising. There's quite a mobile population taking place.
Yeah, it's amazing when you think how difficult travel must have been.
Well, yeah. But then, we think of it now. But again, don't forget, I mean, Carmarthen's a port.
That's right.
A lot easier to travel by sea was far easier. So certainly to get from Ireland into Western Pembrokeshire was just less than a day on a boat.
Yeah. So there's a question about that actually. Are there any signs? Well, it's sort of around about that. Are there any signs of previous bridges on the Towey? Because it looked to me in all those maps and pictures, the bridge is in the same place where it is.
That's right. Yeah. We don't know. The records are of certainly a medieval period of it being a bridge, roughly where it is nowadays. And certainly it was a medieval. The current bridge was, I think, replaced a medieval bridge. I think it was 1939 or so. I can't remember now exact date, but certainly it was a medieval bridge there. And there would have been a precursor to that as well, perhaps a 12th century, 13th century bridge, which may have been timber, roughly in the same place. The Roman one, we don't know. There certainly would have been a Roman bridge there, because we know there's a Roman road which heads off south towards Kidwelly and then onwards. So there's somewhere a Roman bridge, roughly, one imagines, in the position of the current one, but we don't know exactly where.
Ken, I'm aware that you've been speaking for quite a long time. There are a couple more questions. Are you okay to answer just the last question? So there's one of them about the Black Book of Carmarthen. This is a document of earlier oral history. Was the Black Book a document of earlier oral histories, and if so, have we any idea how far back the myths? Great question.
The Black Book of Carmarthen, it's very much a sort of inventory of the Bishop of St David's lands. Is what it was compiled for. The sort of earlier histories, the one that maybe being thought of there is the one about the legend of Merlin, and that comes from Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was writing in the 12th century, I think it is. For someone else might correct me if I'm wrong here, but he said something like, Carmarthen was the birthplace of the ancient Merlin. But I think that's a confusion of the Welsh name for Carmarthen, Caerfyrddin, as in Merlin's fort, but in fact it's incorrect derivation. The Geoffrey of Monmouth was just clutching at straws, basically. So I don't know. So it's a lot of earlier stuff. There isn't much before you get. Obviously the Mabinogion, but actually there isn't an awful lot of documentary evidence prior to the Anglo-Normans. Sort of hard evidence, as it were. I don't say much more sort of factual stuff, as it were, You know, they're writing documents of being compiled for tax purposes and this sort of stuff. And what, yeah.
This is another question from Gwenda Mark. There's a Roman road to Haverfordwest, but no road to Abertavy or Cardigan. Do you think the Romans might not have explored that area? I noticed that actually, being somebody from the Teivi Valley, I did think, oh, did the Romans not get to the lower reaches of the Teivi Valley?
Yeah, it's a good question. It used to be thought that the native population before, as the Romans invaded, was actually were fairly friendly towards Rome, and hence there was no need for military conquest certainly of Pembrokeshire, southern Ceredigion. That's changed now because we've got, we found this big Roman fort at Llandilo, the ones at Carmarthen. We found the ones at Whiston, just north of Haverfordwest. So that picture has changed quite considerably. So we're still finding things, but at the moment, the Roman road, we can trace running west from Carmarthen quite clearly to, let's say, to Whiston, which is just north of Haverfordwest, and then we lose it. And we don't know what happens to it from that point. I can't imagine that the Romans would have ignored sort of Milford Haven waterway as being a huge natural harbour. And also, there are some Roman finds coming up around Carmarthen, around Cardigan, which suggests when you look at Roman artifacts, if you're getting things which are they're quite datable Roman artifacts, very precisely, often coinage with them as well. So if you're getting things which are in the first century AD date, you're pretty sure they're Roman military. An army is there somewhere, and there's a few of those beginning to turn up around Cardigan. So somewhere around Cardigan, we suspect there's a Roman fort, but we don't know where. And there must be one as well somewhere further west than Whiston. So somewhere on the west coast of Pembrokeshire, there's got to be some sort of Roman fort as well, a Roman installation. The Roman road's got to go somewhere.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. So still things to be found, yeah. So and if that's the case, there might well be a Roman road somewhere from West Pembrokeshire up to Cardigan. And if that's the case, there might be another Roman fort somewhere around Fishguard area. So yeah, there's still discovering things. And I think there's going to be one found somewhere around Milford Haven as well at some stage.
Great, really exciting. Well, thank you very much, Ken. I'm sure everybody would like to join me in thanking you for such a fascinating talk. I think there's lots of comments about how people are going to walk around Carmarthen with the different eyes almost, seeing things in a different way at least, which is a really fantastic start to the project, really, because that's one of the things that we really hope people will do. So thank you very much for that. I was hoping at the beginning of thinking about this project to have some kind of study group or book group. But instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to recommend a book at each of our talks. So I'm reading this at the moment, Natives by Akala. It's really amazing book. It's subtitled Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire. And I thought I knew quite a lot about British history, but there's a lot of stuff in here that I didn't know. So this is my book recommendation for tonight. I would just like to thank again our funders, Heritage Lottery and Cadw. Thank you very much to Ken, of course, and to Lisa. Thank you for that talk about the college's involvement. Big thanks to Chris for the technical support. You haven't seen him, but he's been doing lots of important things behind the scenes. And I would like to thank all my colleagues at Oriel Marthin Gallery, also doing lots of things behind the scenes, and Paula at Carmarthen School of Art for your, I don't know if she's here, but thank you, Paula, for your enthusiasm for the project. It's really great and heartening. And thank you all for coming. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi, diolch yn fawr I dod. And goodbye everyone, and stay safe, and hope to see you soon. Hwyl fawr pawb.
Yeah.